In a shadowy crypt within the royal palace of Madrid, among silver candelabras and crimson velvet curtains, lies what is said to be one of the most intimate and disturbing secrets of European monarchy. It is not a treasure, nor a lost crown, nor even the mummified heart of some sainted king. It is something far more personal. According to rumors that have circulated through palatial halls for over 2 centuries, when Ferdinand VII of Spain died in 1833, a specific part of his anatomy was removed and preserved in a crystal jar filled with alcohol. We are not speaking of his viscera or his brain. We are speaking of his male reproductive organ. This story, whispered in shadowy corridors and recorded in forbidden chronicles, has become one of the most bizarre and embarrassing legends in European monarchical history. But could it be true? Was the last great symbol of Spanish royal virility truly preserved for posterity in a bottle like some macabre trophy? And why, of all the kings of Europe, was it precisely Ferdinand VII who ended up being remembered not for his military conquests or political reforms, but for the supposed fate of his genitalia? To understand this grotesque and fascinating story, we must delve into the life of one of the most controversial and despised monarchs in Spanish history. Ferdinand VII was not merely a king. He was a coward, a traitor, a tyrant, and, according to his own subjects, a man whose questionable masculinity became the perfect reflection of the decadence of an empire that had forever lost its glory. Ferdinand was born in 1784, son of King Charles IV and Queen Maria Luisa of Parma, in a Spain that was no longer the world power that had dominated the oceans during previous centuries. The Spanish Empire was in terminal decline. It had lost its American colonies, its navy had been destroyed by the English, and its economy was bankrupt. Worse still, revolutionary and later Napoleonic France threatened to swallow the entire Iberian Peninsula. From a young age, Ferdinand displayed a profoundly disturbing personality. He was known for his cowardice, his tendency toward betrayal, and his inability to maintain any lasting loyalty. Even as Prince of Asturias, he actively conspired against his own father, going so far as to write secret letters to Napoleon Bonaparte, asking for support to overthrow Charles IV. This family betrayal would be merely the first of many acts that would define his reputation as el rey felon, the traitor king. In 1808, when he finally managed to force his father's abdication and assumed the throne, Ferdinand lasted only 2 months as king. Napoleon, who had been manipulating the Spanish royal family like pieces on a chessboard, summoned both father and son to a meeting in Bayonne, France. There, in one of the most humiliating episodes in European monarchical history, Ferdinand voluntarily renounced the Spanish throne in favor of Joseph Bonaparte, Napoleon's brother, in exchange for a French pension and the promise of a castle in France. While the Spanish people rose up in a bloody 6-year war against French occupation, their legitimate king lived comfortably as Napoleon's guest at the castle of Valenciennes, organizing dinners, playing musical instruments, and flirting with ladies of the French court. This monumental cowardice was seen by the Spanish people as the ultimate betrayal. While guerrillas lived in the mountains fighting and dying for their homeland, Ferdinand ate oysters and drank champagne at the table of his captors. During these years of golden exile, the first rumors about the king's questionable masculinity began to circulate. Diplomatic correspondence from the period, preserved in French archives, makes veiled allusions to the Spanish monarch's personal weaknesses. This was not merely about political cowardice. There were whispers about his physical virility. Some French chroniclers of the time suggested that Ferdinand might be impotent, which would explain his ease in trading a kingdom for a life of superficial pleasures. When Napoleon was finally defeated in 1814, Ferdinand returned to Spain not as a liberating hero, but as a deeply compromised figure. The people, in an impressive demonstration of naivety or desperation, received him as el deseado, the desired one. This warm reception must have been one of the greatest political misunderstandings in European history, for Ferdinand immediately demonstrated that his years in France had not changed his fundamental character in the slightest. His first measure as the restored king was to completely abolish the Constitution of 1812, which had been drafted during his absence by the Cortes of Cadiz and represented the most advanced liberal ideals of the time. Ferdinand restored the most brutal absolutism, relentlessly persecuted all the liberals who had fought for Spain's independence, and established a reign of terror that would make the worst tyrants in history envious. But it was in his personal life that the darkest and most disturbing aspects of Ferdinand's personality were revealed. He married 4 times, and each marriage was marked by rumors, scandals, and, most significantly, by the king's apparent inability to produce heirs. His first marriage was to Maria Antonia of Naples in 1802, when he was still a prince. Maria Antonia died in 1806 without having children, and rumors circulated that the marriage had never been consummated. His second marriage, to Isabella of Braganza, daughter of the King of Portugal, took place in 1816. Isabella was described as an exceptionally beautiful and intelligent woman, but the couple had no children during the 3 years the marriage lasted before the Queen's premature death. Again, whispers in the palace corridors suggested there were intimate problems between the spouses. Ferdinand's third marriage, to Maria Josepha Amalia of Saxony, was even more embarrassing. Maria Josepha was a pragmatic and determined woman who supposedly tried every method known at the time to become pregnant. Doctors were consulted, special prayers were performed, pilgrimages were organized, but during 7 years of marriage, no heir appeared. The European court began to openly laugh at the Spanish king's inability to fulfill what was considered the most basic duty of any monarch, ensuring dynastic succession. It was during this period that the rumors about Ferdinand's masculinity became more specific and cruel. Foreign ambassadors wrote in their diplomatic reports about the Spanish king's particular difficulty. Satirical pamphlets circulated secretly through Madrid, making jokes about la falta del rey, the king's lack. Some went so far as to suggest that Ferdinand might have been born with genital deformities, or that some disease had compromised his reproductive capacity. The situation became so embarrassing that when Maria Josepha died in 1829, Ferdinand, already 45 years old, was practically forced by the royal council to attempt a fourth marriage. The chosen one was Maria Cristina of Bourbon II Sicilies, his niece, 23 years younger than him. This marriage had a desperate tone. It was the king's last chance to produce an heir and save his reputation both politically and personally. Surprisingly, Maria Cristina became pregnant almost immediately. In October 1830, Princess Isabella was born, and 2 years later, Princess Luisa Fernanda. Finally, after 3 sterile marriages, Ferdinand had managed to produce offspring. The cruel irony was that after decades of obsession with a male heir, his only children were girls. The birth of the princesses should have silenced the rumors about Ferdinand's masculinity, but it actually had the opposite effect. It was whispered that the children might not be the king's daughters, but those of some lover of the young queen. Others suggested that Ferdinand had finally found effective medical treatments, or that special prayers had worked a miracle. The most malicious rumors insinuated that the king might have used artificial methods, a shocking idea for the time, but one that demonstrated how far his reputation had deteriorated. During the last years of his reign, Ferdinand became an increasingly pathetic and hated figure. His health deteriorated rapidly. He suffered from gout, chronic digestive problems, and obesity that frequently confined him to bed. His temperament, always volatile, became completely unpredictable. He alternated between periods of deep depression and explosions of tyrannical fury that terrorized the court. The most disturbing aspect of Ferdinand's final years was his growing obsession with his own masculinity and virility. Medical reports from the period, preserved in the royal archives, indicate that the king constantly consulted his doctors about intimate matters, demanding treatments to improve his sexual performance and ensure more children. He consumed all kinds of potions and elixirs, supposedly aphrodisiac, from powdered rhinoceros horn to extracts of exotic plants imported from the American colonies. This fixation on his virility seemed to be directly connected to his growing political paranoia. Ferdinand had always been an insecure king, but in the last years of his life, he developed a morbid obsession with the idea that his enemies questioned not only his political authority, but his fundamental masculinity. He interpreted any criticism of his government as a personal attack on his virility and responded with a brutality that shocked even by the standards of the time. In September 1833, Ferdinand became gravely ill. His doctors diagnosed a combination of acute gout, kidney problems, and what today would probably be identified as advanced diabetes. For months, he agonized in a bed at the royal palace, alternating between feverish delirium and moments of terrifying lucidity, in which he demonstrated being fully aware of his proximity to death. It was during this prolonged agony that Ferdinand made a decision that would become the most remembered aspect of his entire reign. According to later accounts, the king, obsessed until the end with questions of masculinity and succession, supposedly gave specific instructions about the treatment of his body after death. Some sources suggest that he himself ordered that his genital organ be preserved as a kind of proof of his virility for posterity. When Ferdinand finally died on September 29, 1833, his body was subjected to the typical embalming process of the time for members of royalty. This procedure involved the removal of internal organs, treatment of the body with preservative substances, and preparation for the state funeral. It was during this process that, according to legend, the episode occurred that would give rise to the most persistent and embarrassing rumor associated with the name of Ferdinand VII. The exact details vary depending on the source, but the most common version of the story suggests that, by express order of the king himself or someone close to him, Ferdinand's genital organ was removed during embalming and preserved separately in a crystal jar filled with alcohol. This jar was supposedly secretly kept in the personal archives of the royal family, ostensibly as a kind of relic of royal masculinity. The first documented mention of this story appears in Spanish chronicles from the late 19th century, approximately 60 years after Ferdinand's death. Historian Benito Pérez Galdós, in his National Episodes, makes a veiled reference to the curious fate of the mortal remains of the desired one. Other chroniclers of the time, such as Ramón de Mesonero Romanos, include similar allusions in their memoirs of the Isabelline court. The story gained international strength when French writer Alexandre Dumas the Elder, in his travel memoirs through Spain, mentioned having heard rumors about a particular royal relic kept in the Palace of Madrid. Dumas, known for his tendency towards sensationalism, described being informed by a Spanish nobleman about the last trophy of the Spanish Bourbon dynasty, in a clear reference to the supposed preserved organ. During the 20th century, the legend was perpetuated by various authors and journalists. Writer Gerald Brennan, in his classic The Spanish Labyrinth, mentions having heard the story during his stay in Spain in the 1920s. American and French journalists who visited Madrid frequently included references to the legend in their reports about the Spanish royal family. What makes this story particularly fascinating is not so much its veracity, which is impossible to prove, but what it reveals about Ferdinand VII's reputation and about 19th century Spanish society. The fact that this specific legend has persisted for so long, being repeated and embellished through generations, suggests that it captured something fundamental about how Ferdinand was perceived by his contemporaries and by posterity. The obsession with preserving the dead king's genital organ can be interpreted as the final symbol of a monarchy obsessed with questions of legitimacy and succession, but incapable of addressing the real problems it faced. Ferdinand VII had spent his entire life fighting against rumors about his masculinity and his ability to produce heirs. The idea that even in death, he would have tried to prove his virility by physically preserving the organ in question has a perverse logic when we consider his personality and obsessions. Furthermore, the legend reflects the attitudes of the time regarding royal masculinity and political power. In a society that saw male reproductive capacity as directly linked to political authority, an impotent or sterile king was not just a personal tragedy, but a constitutional crisis. The preservation of the royal genital organ would be, in this context, a desperate attempt to maintain some vestige of dynastic legitimacy. The story also reveals the particular cruelty of Spanish popular humor. The Spanish people, who had suffered under Ferdinand's tyrannical regime, found in the legend of the preserved organ a way to posthumously ridicule a king they had hated in life. The idea that the only part of Ferdinand considered worthy of preservation would be precisely that about which so many humiliating rumors had circulated represents a particularly sophisticated form of popular revenge. From a historical standpoint, it is important to note that no physical evidence of this supposed relic has ever been found. No official inventory of Spanish royal archives has ever listed such an item, and not even during the political turbulence of the 20th century, when many royal secrets came to light, did any concrete proof of the mysterious jar's existence appear. Researchers who have had access to the archives of the Spanish royal house report never having found any document that confirms the story. Similarly, none of the successive Spanish kings has ever made any reference to the supposed relic, which would be expected if it really existed and was considered important to the dynasty. This absence of evidence, however, has not diminished the power of the legend. If anything, the impossibility of definitively proving or refuting the story has only increased its appeal. The legend of Ferdinand VII's preserved organ has become one of those stories that transcend facts to become part of cultural folklore. During the Spanish Civil War and the subsequent Franco dictatorship, the legend took on new political meanings. Republicans and communists used the story as an example of the decadence and ridiculousness of the monarchy, while monarchists tried to suppress it or discredit it. Franco, himself obsessed with questions of masculinity and authority, supposedly hated any mention of the story and tried to remove it from official history books. Ironically, it was during the democratic period after Franco's death that the legend gained new life. Historians and journalists, finally free to explore previously censored aspects of Spanish history, rediscovered and popularized the story. Popular history books, television programs, and even films made references to the legend, ensuring that it continued to be part of Spanish cultural consciousness. The persistence of this particular story also reflects changes in social attitudes towards sexuality and power. In the 21st century, the idea of a king obsessed with his virility to the point of preserving his genital organ after death seems not just strange, but profoundly pathological. This change in perspective has transformed Ferdinand VII from a possibly tragic figure into a genuinely grotesque character. From a psychological standpoint, the legend offers fascinating insights into the nature of absolute power and its distortions. Ferdinand VII exemplifies what happens when someone with unlimited power develops personal obsessions. These obsessions inevitably become matters of state. His fixation with his own masculinity was not just a personal neurosis, but something that affected Spain's foreign and domestic policy. The comparison with other European monarchs of the time is revealing. Louis XVIII of France, Ferdinand's contemporary, also faced rumors about his sexuality and ability to have children, but managed to maintain his royal dignity and never became the subject of such humiliating legends. The difference may lie in the fact that Louis XVIII, despite his limitations, was respected for his intelligence and political skill, while Ferdinand was universally despised for his cowardice and betrayal. The story of the supposed preserved organ also illustrates how 19th century European monarchies were struggling against social and political changes that made many of their traditions and justifications for power obsolete. Ferdinand's obsession with proving his physical masculinity reflected an instinctive understanding that royal authority was being questioned at fundamental levels. In terms of historical legacy, the legend accomplished something that none of his actual policies could, making Ferdinand VII truly memorable. While his administrative reforms, military decisions, and economic policies are known only to specialists, the story of his supposedly preserved organ is known to anyone with casual interest in Spanish history. This final irony, that a king who spent his life obsessed with his reputation and legacy ended up being remembered primarily for a humiliating legend about his genitalia, represents perhaps the cruelest revenge that history could have exercised upon Ferdinand VII. He wanted to be remembered as a great absolute king. Instead, he is remembered as the king whose sexual organ was supposedly preserved in a jar. The legend also serves as a somber reminder about the fragility of royal dignity and about how quickly a reputation can transform into ridicule. Ferdinand VII died believing he had restored Spanish absolutism and guaranteed the future of the Bourbon dynasty. In reality, his daughter Isabella II would be dethroned by a revolution just 35 years later, and the Spanish monarchy would face existential crises throughout the 20th century. Today, almost 2 centuries after Ferdinand VII's death, the story of his supposedly preserved organ continues to circulate on the internet, in popular documentaries, and in alternative history books. It has become a permanent part of European royal mythology, alongside other legends such as the supposed hemophilia of the Romanovs, or the madness of George III of England. The truth about whether Ferdinand VII's genital organ was actually preserved will probably never be known. The Spanish royal archives keep their secrets, and many documents were lost or destroyed during the political turbulence of the 19th and 20th centuries. But perhaps factual truth is less important than the symbolic truth that the legend represents. The story of the king with Europe's most controversial member is, fundamentally, a parable about power, masculinity, and the futility of human vanity. Ferdinand VII dedicated his life to trying to prove his virility and authority, only to become an object of ridicule for posterity. If his organ was indeed preserved in a jar, it would be merely the final physical symbol of a life wasted on empty obsessions and unnecessary cruelties. In the end, the legend of Ferdinand VII reminds us that history has a cruel way of humiliating those who are most concerned with their own grandeur. The king who most feared being ridiculed for his lack of masculinity became precisely that, not because he was preserved in a jar, but because his personality and actions revealed a poverty of spirit that no physical demonstration of virility could mask. History can never be embalmed, and it always finds ways to reveal the truth about those who try to control it.